Hello and welcome to episode 5 of The Briefing Room. And this week we shall be talking to Fredrick Taylor and we'll be talking about his book Dresden. And I'll put a link for this book down below. It's a very, very good book. The whole history of Dresden is in here and the history of the Dresden bombing. Now, Dresden bombing was a little controversial. Some people think that it was a war crime. Some people say it was justified. But we'll talk to Fredrick Taylor and we'll see what he thinks. Also, if you think that it was a war crime, if you think that it was justified, put your comments in the comment section down below because you are a member of the briefing room, just like myself and the guests. So if you like this content, please like and subscribe, and you'll catch every episode that we do. For now, history. Well, Fredrick Taylor, welcome to the briefing room.
John, good to be here.
And what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about your book, Dresden, and very controversial but excellent read. Excellent read. And we'll talk about the controversy later. But the very first thing that I want to talk about is something that nothing to do with the bombing at all. And I tell this to everybody all listening, some people who don't want to. But the Dresden, China, I was really fascinated by how that came about, by it being invented by an alchemist who was in prison.
Yes, well, the alchemy didn't actually work. No spoiler alert there. But he actually saved himself by actually finding a way of imitating the Chinese porcelain that was imported at huge expense up to that point, and thus making the king very pleased and very rich as a result. So he stopped being an alchemist basically and started being a proper chemist.
Well,
and made what became known as Dresden porcelain, even though it was actually produced 20 miles upstream at Meissen, a medieval town on the river 20 miles upstream, as I say. So it's a really weird story.
Yeah. I found that fascinating. Your book is highly regarded. What drew you to write about Dresden?
Well, I'm very interested in Germany. I studied German and history at university, and spent some time, as sadly unfinished PhD. The pram in the hall intervened, and spent a lot of time in Germany, east and west, in the early to mid 70s, and was fascinated by the language, fascinated by the people, fascinated by the kind of political and social problems that Germany had, despite being a big, inventive, energetic, powerful country. It seemed to keep on making missteps, and the people seemed to kind of be clapping and cheering those missteps along, and I wondered why, and it's something that's intrigued me ever since. Dresden itself I had never visited. I visited Weimar, I visited East Berlin, Potsdam, Merseburg, in East Germany as a research student in the mid 70s, and so I'd read David Irving's book. Now Irving is a very good writer and a very energetic researcher, sadly, also slightly politically extreme in his approach to aspects of German history. And so that fascinated me. And I actually, to be perfectly honest, I was sitting in the pub with a friend of mine having lunch, and we were talking about World War II bombing at Dresden. And I said, now that Germany has been reunified and we can have open access to all the archives and talk to people, and they don't have to worry about what they say to you being misinterpreted by the authorities, which before 1989 tended to be the case. Maybe I can have a crack at it. My German is fluent, so I can handle all that. Because in East Germany, by and large, they were taught Russian as a second language. So at that time, certainly, when you went to East Germany, you had to be able to speak German. because some people spoke English, but not very many. Not like West Germany, where almost everybody spoke a bit of English.
Hmm.
In East Germany, that was not the case. And I put a proposal together, and my agent persuaded a publisher to take it on, Bloomsbury, and off I went. And 3 years later, up the book popped.
Well, it would, like I say, it's really interesting. I do like the history of Dresden before the even the bombing comes into frame. And as you said, you were granted unprecedented access to the archives, especially after the German reunification. What do you think was the most significant uh, challenges to to the existing narrative?
Well, the existing narrative was still by and large, I mean, there had been actually a wonderful book written in German, sadly never translated into English, by a man called Götz Bergander, who is from Dresden and actually was 18 years old at the time of the raid and actually experienced it. I mean, hid in the family shelter underneath a distillery where his father was the technical director, and survived it, and became a journalist, went to the West, um, and became a journalist in Berlin, and wrote this wonderful book called Dresden in the Air War,
Mm.
which is not just about the bombing in February 1945, about the whole experience of the city um, in the Second World War, and aspects of why there was something really distinctive and peculiar and tragic about its fate. Um, so, you look for things, and one thing leads to another. You meet Götz, who became a friend. I mean, he's sadly no longer with us. He'd be 100 years old if he was still alive. Um, and they introduce to somebody else, and then you introduce to somebody else, and you talk to somebody else. And that's how it goes. You have to get an end
Yeah,
so that the people trust you, so that they won't feel you're going to distort anything they say. And that's particularly important in the case of Dresden, because the whole thing is still very controversial in Dresden itself and internationally. And there was this whole thing, oh, this was this perfectly innocent city. City without industry was the term that was used. They just made bone china, that's all they ever
mm.
did. Why did you bomb them? Beautiful palaces and buildings and churches and so on. Latter, of course, which is perfectly true. And a beautiful city is largely restored now, and you can see to some extent how beautiful it was. But and I started off actually sort of pretty much accepting that version of things, and then thinking, but what else can I find out if I look around and talk to people and read things and so on. And my view started to change, not in any way that was radical. It was slow, and I
Yeah.
realized that actually there were 70,000 people engaged in war industries in Dresden,
Wow.
and all the wonderful industries that they had, mainly middle class luxury items, cigarettes, and candy, and cameras, and typewriters, and things like that. By 1944-45, were no longer innocent. They had been put over to making things for the war effort. I mean, when you have a machine that makes cigarettes, you can turn it into making small arms ammunition pretty easily, and they did. And this happened with lots of other things. The Zeiss Econ lenses could be used. Like the war uses are obvious for lenses. I mean, both cameras and guidance systems. The radio factory, Radio Mender, made communications equipment
Mm.
and electronic fuses and all sorts of things like that. Even Dresden was very artsy. We'll probably discuss that. Before the First World War, especially, there was a big progressive um, artist colony in the north of the city, where they, made arts and crafts. But there are very similar movements in England. There was,
Yeah.
a lot of interchange actually between those two centers of those arts and crafts movement 120, 130 years ago. But by 1944, 45, they were making, fins for V2 rockets. They were making tailplanes for flats, all out of wood, just as, 10, 15 years earlier, they had made nice little crafty things out of wood. Now they were making bits for weapons and military vehicles that fly. So that gradually you find out these things. It doesn't mean that you think, some people accuse saying, oh no, you think that Dresden deserved it then. No, but you just, let's not distort things. Let's not pretend that Dresden was this completely harmless place. I mean, I've also written a book about Coventry. And the thing about Coventry is that it was an industrial city with a surprising amount of wonderful history and beautiful buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, Dresden was a city full of history and beautiful buildings, but a surprising amount of industry as well. So there's that comparison, I think, holds true. And so moral judgments, and at the moment, of course, we're looking at proportionality and other matters concerned, particularly in the bombing war. I mean, at the moment, we can look at the situation in Gaza and say, is that proportional?
Yeah.
Israel is reacting to something and has had a right to react, but is its reaction disproportionate? And of course, the similar argument comes in with the bombing of Dresden in 1945, among other places. I mean, there were lots of other fine cities, Würzburg, Darmstadt, all these lovely old German cities that were bombed in 40-45 as well. And Dresden is possibly the most egregious example.
And again, I found it fascinating how the people of Dresden took what they already had, like you said, the cigarette machine, and turned it into something that creates ammunition. I thought that was really fascinating as well, that they can just take what they've already got and just change it.
Well, it's just a matter of switching machine tools around.
Yeah.
And the Germans are very good at machine tools.
And could you elaborate on the planning and decision-making process of the bombing command and USAAF that led to the Dresden bombing?
Dresden wasn't really on the major list before late-ish 44. For a start, it was a long way. And by 44, the British were bombing places like Brux, which was in Bohemia, in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, just across the border from Dresden, which is very close to the Czech border.
Yeah.
And also they had invented things like drop tanks, which meant that bomber groups, particularly the Americans who flew by day and attacked by day, could protect them. Before that, and before these drop tanks were invented, it was so that you had extra fuel, which you then discarded, and then, for the return trip.
Yeah.
So it didn't have to carry all this fuel. And so escorts, P-47s, P-51s, could escort bomber groups far into Germany in a way that they haven't been able to do until this point. So attacking these further eastern places, Königsberg, it's quite a long way. Dresden is a long way. Leipzig, Chemnitz, which was the major Saxon industrial city, more important in many ways than Dresden. For an industrial point of view, it's not such a big city, and nowhere near as pretty. It's more like kind of Manchester.
Yeah.
So it became obvious that sooner or later Dresden might be bombed. I mean, there had been a real sense of security.
Yeah.
I mean, there were all these rumors. People said, oh, because Dresden, before the First World War, especially its golden age, had been a place where there were tens of thousands of foreigners living, because it was a nice place to live, because of the culture, because of, there were things like, there was a great season of winter balls in Dresden where you could send your daughters to find a suitable marriage and things like that. People would stay in Dresden for the season, and many would stay there permanently. There was a Russian church, there was an American church, there was a British church, and so on. Church of England church, I should say. So there was all that, and so they had this feeling of security. As one of them put it, the British love us. They wouldn't want to bomb us. And then some people thought that Churchill had an aunt who lived in Dresden and all this kind of stuff, which was not impossible actually, because there was this large English-speaking population at one point. So they had this sense of security. The technicians, the people of the fire department and the air raid defense department in Dresden weren't quite so convinced. But the average Dresdener, wandering around their beautiful city thinking, why would anybody want to blow this all up? The average Dresdener had one point of view, but then the people who really knew what was what, as I say, even the Gauleiter Mutzmann, who we might talk about, was a dreadful man, deeply stupid and bigoted. And the Saxon Mussolini, they called him. He looked like Mussolini, shaven head and stocky. And they knew. They just hoped that it wouldn't happen. That's the only real defense they had. And was largely incompetent. Dresden was never given the kind of money to build air raid shelters, which again is a problem we'll have to get to later. Like were built in say Leipzig, which is not that far from Dresden in Saxony, and again an industrial town, and in other major places like the huge flak towers with attendant bomb shelters in Berlin and various other major cities. Dresden really didn't have anything like that. The Nazi leadership had various bunkers, which were very safe, but the average Dresdener did not.
Typical.
And by 1944, when they did realize that they could well get themselves bombed at some point, it was too late. They didn't have the resources or the money or anything else to build proper shelters. So that was Dresden's delusion, and why it came as such a shock when the place was actually bombed.
Yeah, and totally unready for it.
Yes, totally pretty much. It had actually been bombed twice before on a relatively small scale in October 1944.
Yeah.
On the edge there, and then again in January, the Americans zipped over and bombed part of the city and destroyed a couple of apartment blocks, plus a cigarette factory designed in a fake Ottoman mosque style by Hitler's brother-in-law, curiously enough.
Wow.
Hanscher, who was married to Hitler's sister. And but it didn't seem to somehow jerk the public out of their complacency. I mean, people still were astonished by what happened on February the 13th, 14th, 1945. And they shouldn't have been, but they were.
Well, another one of your central characters, I guess, is the weather that you describe, and the conditions, and like we say, the lack of German defences on the night of the bombing. How did everything factor in, and including the lack of bomb shelters, how did that all factor in what happened, in the result of what happened?
Bombing, particularly in the Second World War, was incredibly weather dependent, and the winter of 1944-45 was a particularly filthy winter, where a great amount of the time you could not see the ground. And so the meteorological outlook right up to the last moment before the planes actually took off on this or that mission was incredibly important. It depended whether you could really carry out accurate bombing, or whether you just have to more or less find the place, look down through the the fog of the weather and hope you hit something, which is pretty much what happened a lot of the time. I mean, the Americans were particularly proud of the accuracy of their bombing, particularly as it was daylight bombing, which should have theoretically have been easier in that regard in terms of seeing the target. They said that they had the Norton bomb sight, which is they could, drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 10,000 feet. Slight exaggeration. And mostly they did, and they tended to, for perfectly practical reasons, to carry out bombing on industrial and military targets more accurately than the Brits. I mean, the British had given up basically on precision bombing way back, 1941, 42, because it just didn't work. So hence you had the carpet bombing, hence you had the night bombing, to protect the planes from, to some extent at least, from anti-aircraft capabilities that the Germans gradually developed as the war went on until they were actually extremely efficient. I mean, the Americans in 44, 45, though, the weather was so bad, by and large, on average, that I think it was something like 70% of their bombing was actually carrying out with H2X, which is basically radar-based bombing. They couldn't see what they were looking at. And something like 2% of that was within 1,000 feet of the actual target at that point. So anyway, so the bombing of Dresden didn't happen in the early part of 45. It was intended, by and large, along with bombing on the other major East German cities, Leipzig, Chemnitz, and Berlin to some extent, to help the Russians. One of the main aims of the bombing campaign all the time, particularly before D-Day, was to convince the Russians that we were doing something to help them. In other words, they were bleeding to death there on the Eastern Front and sacrificing millions of young Russian lives to defeat the Germans and keep the Germans from taking the whole of the Soviet Union. And all the Brits could really do was to say, well, we're bombing the Germans, because we weren't actually fighting. Well, finally, we went to Italy in late 43, and finally then there was D-Day. But before that, the Brits weren't exactly doing that much on the ground. But they were bombing the Germans, and they could say to Stalin whenever he complained, look, we're bombing the Germans.
Mm. And it was all planes and fighting in the ocean. There was no boots on the ground, or very few boots on the ground.
Absolutely. Until then, until D-Day, basically.
Yeah.
That's when we really, the Brits and the Americans, of course, obviously, started to put in a conventional military contribution, which started to really squeeze the Germans from the other side. So you had from, the breakout in July, August 44 from the Normandy beachhead until the end of the war, the Germans now were permanently squeezed from both sides, from the west by the Anglo-Americans and from the east by the Russians. But the Russians still wanted help with their big offensive, which they had planned for mid-February. And the British and the Americans agreed at the Yalta conference, where Roosevelt's last big conference before his death in the Crimea, that they would bomb the East German cities in a major way to help the Russian offensive and throw the German supply lines and into confusion and just basically sort of mean that the Germans couldn't reinforce or bring supplies forward with the same kind of efficiency they usually could. In fact, they hoped to create complete chaos, particularly as there were refugees now coming from the eastern part of Germany, East Prussia and Pomerania and so on, where the Russians had already set foot by early 1945. And so the idea was to bomb cities, create chaos with the refugee columns and with the railways, Dresden was basically north, south, and east, west. The railways went, north, south,
Yeah.
and then east, west across into the front. And so it was actually a particularly good place to bomb, actually, from that point of view.
Yeah.
How efficient it actually was on the night, we could discuss, but that was the idea. So, I think the point is that there were all these pressures on the Brits to do something. There was always pressure to do something from the Russians.
Mm.
They wanted the Western powers to make sacrifices and to do the things that were necessary. I mean, they were not that far apart, of course. By February 1945, the two fronts were really not that far apart. 250 miles, I suppose, I don't know. And the Russians were only 70 to 100 miles from Dresden, a couple of hours, decent drive. So this was the moment when these things particularly were due to happen, this concatenation of circumstances, when Dresden came into the sights of the West during those few weeks. Dresden had been vaguely spoken about. Bomber Harris was quite keen on bombing Dresden at one point. He suggested it back, I think, in the autumn of 44, but it hadn't actually led to anything much happening. But this is when it really came forward. There's a whole thing about Yalta and arguments about whether the Russians certainly asked the Western Allies to bomb Berlin and Leipzig and Chemnitz. It's left out from most minutes of the meetings whether they asked them also to bomb Dresden. Hugh Lungi, who was Churchill's interpreter, he was a British guy whose mother was Russian and had been brought up speaking Russian. He was only about 25 at the time, I think, 1920. And I spoke to him on the phone before he died about this, said definitely that at the meeting he was at and interpreting for, not for Churchill, but for the British General Staff members, they were lent him as an interpreter for that meeting, that that the Russians definitely also mentioned Dresden, that Antonov, the Russian deputy chief of staff, definitely said that he wanted them to bomb Dresden as well as the other cities. So you pays your money and you takes your choice. I mean, I see no reason why Lungi would lie. He's not at all not at all that kind of person, and he wasn't like a career military either. He actually worked for the BBC after the war.
And those people all knew, like the Russians, all knew that those cities were crucial to the war effort.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The British. There's something called the Bombers Baedeker, as it's known, which was basically briefing sheets on all the major German towns and cities. It's a rather sort of ironic title, since the tourism was of a very lethal sort. And it spoke about Dresden and did say that it had industries, but that they weren't sure exactly how much they'd been actually converted to wartime use. So the British, I don't think, did have close information about exactly what was being made in these factories these days, but they suspected certain things, and they were probably even more right than they thought, in that these factories had gone over to war work. So yeah. I mean, Leipzig and Chemnitz particularly was started off as a textile center, but also they made cars before the war and trucks. And so they ended up making kind of obviously armored cars and tanks and things like that. And Leipzig too was obviously a commercial and industrial center, as well as an important rail junction and all those things that you would expect from a city like that. So yeah, that was where they were. And Dresden, by the way, was also had the second largest military garrison after Berlin.
Oh wow.
The garrison in the northern part of the city across the Elbe um, was I think about 20,000. Um, oddly enough, it wasn't actually bombed that much. They should have bombed it, but they sort of didn't. Um, after on the night, or the big night. But yeah, it was definitely there. All those targets were there. They weren't always hit by the Brits or the Americans, but Dresden had all these things. It was not the city without industry and not the city without
Yeah.
strategic or importance that many critics of the bombing have claimed. There are reasons for criticizing the bombing. I'm personally rather a Guardian reading pacifist, basically by nature, and it still appalls me. I mean, particularly having spoken to people who experienced it, the bombing that night. But you have to, put that aside and look at it all quite so coolly, and say, well, what actually is going on here, and what was justified. We know what was not justified in many ways. We should still have that beautiful city intact, but we don't, and we can regret that, um, and, and and regret the ruthlessness of the Allies, necessary as it must have seemed at the time, that led to the destruction of a gorgeous city. I mean,
Yeah.
this most beautiful city in Germany, no beautiful city of any size anyway. So yeah, there we go.
And we don't know what sort of pressures that the people in charge are under. We don't know how far in advance they have to make decisions. So they have to make tough decisions sometimes, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much objection was raised. To be honest, uh, I don't think it was perceived as a particularly tough decision at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to be brutally honest. Um,
Were there any regrets after?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
you can always have regrets after.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Churchill himself, at the end of March, wrote a memo which was never came to light after the war,
Yeah.
in which he said, that Germany, that Britain, they couldn't carry on doing what amounted to terror bombing like the bombing of Dresden, which was a pretty amazing admission. Because I mean, like all governments, the British government in the Second World War claimed that every raid they carried out was a non-legitimate military or industrial target. They would never admit bombing civilians.
Did he use those words? Did he actually call it a terror bombing?
Yeah.
Wow.
He did.
Wow.
Yeah. He did, and of course, that's why the memo sort of disappeared and never made its way through the process much, because they said you can't say that. You cannot say that, Prime Minister. But he was obviously upset. Churchill was a strange man. I mean, he would get very emotional. He was fierce and ruthless in many ways, like any wartime leader, I guess, has to be. But I mean, there was a case in, I think, the summer of 1943 when he was shown photographs of the damage done by the RAF on big raids on the Ruhr area, the great big industrial area in Western Germany. And he said, well, are we big? He wept and said, are we beasts that we do these things, and then the next morning he'd be back on track again, And I think this is one of those examples where Churchill's kind of emotions overcame him, and he was sort of suddenly appalled. As I think, if you really think about these things when you're doing them, you're probably not going to do them.
Yeah.
And
what about the pilots? Did they have regrets?
I don't think they did. I mean, for the most part, a few may have done. But I was lucky enough when I was doing the research for the book, 2001 to, there was still quite a lot of people around in their 70s who had flown as aircrew
Yeah.
to Dresden. And no, I mean, one guy, Flight Lieutenant Hay, uh, had been, he and his wife had been in the peace movement before the war, and but he said, I just realized that we had to do this. We had to,
Yeah.
we had to, Germany had, Hitler had to be defeated at all costs. And another guy, Derek Jackson, he was a tail gun, he was only 19 at the time, said, I said, at one point, I was talking to him, and I said, did you know about Auschwitz at the time? Because Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians
Yeah.
about three weeks before Dresden was bombed. He said, no. And that's true. It wasn't that much publicized, actually. Um, but if I had, I'd have, done any number of Dresdens. I wouldn't have cared if I had known about Auschwitz. So on the whole, I think it became routinized. I mean, the main thing was just getting there and getting back in one piece, getting there, dropping the bombs and getting back in one piece. That's what people thought about. And that's what was the chief concern.
Yeah.
And, the Germans were trying to kill you, by the way. It's not like you went on this little drop some bombs and went back. Um, a lot of the time that you were trying to either go there or go back, people were trying to kill you from the
Yeah.
ground,
Yeah.
or night fighters or whatever you ran into. So I think most people just wanted the war to be over,
Hmm.
and if this
Yeah.
helped to win the war, helped to end the war, then it obviously had to be done as far as most people were concerned, I think. And there was a small minority of, 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 of the Bombing Restriction Committee. Um, there was all these idealistic liberal folk um, who said that there should be severe restrictions on what could be bombed and when it could be bombed and all the rest of it. Released leaflets and booklets and distributed them and so on. The Germans were thrilled, by the way. I came across accounts of the Bombing Restrictions Committee's activities in the archives of the German Foreign Office in Bern. They were thrilled. Um, there we are. Even the Brits are complaining about the barbarism of their air force. Of course, it was a tiny minority, but nevertheless, it's there. But I think it's only after the war, when everybody had, so to speak, calmed down a bit, and when the war was over, and also when they went in and started seeing what the German cities were
Yeah.
like. I mean, after the war, immediately afterward, lots of British aircraft went over and they actually went down low and took pictures of the damage.
Yeah.
And apparently, a lot of the air crew, who were the same air crew, in most cases, who had been dropping bombs a few weeks or months earlier, were appalled. I mean, now that they came to think about it and to see how grim the actual damage was, how total and grim the damage was, that it hit home. But not I think while the war was happening. There was just
Yeah.
too much else to think about.
I mean, it was devastating, and the concept of a firestorm is, I think, central to your narrative. Could you explain the meteorological and physical conditions that create a firestorm?
Firestorms basically um, when a concentration of high explosive, usually followed by massive drops of incendiary bombs, causes such a concentration of fires over a sizable area of a target city or town that the temperature reaches 700,000 whatever degrees Fahrenheit. And then
Wow.
the air gets sucked up. I mean, hot air rises, as we know.
Yeah.
The air gets sucked up, leaving down below a vacuum filled with carbon monoxide,
Hmm.
basically, is all that's left. Um, and it's a storm. It is literally a storm. It's like it's being sucked. People caught in the street could be just picked up and thrown around and sucked up into the air and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah.
And it would suck all the air out of, say you had an open cellar
Mm.
in which people were sheltering, it would actually suck all the oxygen out and send it up with the rest of the air
Yeah.
that was rising from the
So people
firestorm.
suffocate.
People suffocated. I mean,
Mm.
in Dresden, a lot of people were destroyed by high explosive bombs or burned alive in the fire. But a
Yeah.
great many were found sitting on benches or whatever in cellars, just turned pink from carbon monoxide and dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, there was one woman who I got to know, um, Anita Court, she was just 12 years old at the time, who was sheltering in a cellar with her parents. And they could feel the air, becoming unbreathable. And her parents, who were very doting, they were a very close little family, got her a damp blanket over her face and
Hmm.
told her to just, lie down. And they did the same. And she did. And she woke up some hours later when the second raid was over and the firestorm was still on, but had abated somewhat.
Hmm.
Somebody, a young man looking for his girlfriend, broke open the window into the cellar and came in. And she was the only person in that cellar still alive
Oh
because of
wow.
the water from the wet blanket had somehow kept her alive, and given it a mixture which was breathable enough for her to survive that long. And he fished her out. He just noticed she was moving slightly. Everyone else was dead. Um, Again, just not in any way damaged, just
Yeah.
turned this pink from the carbon monoxide and passed out and never woke up, basically. Um, it's anyway, and the firestorm meant that it moved very, very quickly. You see, one of the myths about Dresden is that it was this old medieval town. It wasn't a medieval town at all. Um, the medieval town had pretty much been destroyed in 1694, if you must know,
Yeah.
by a big city fire. And after that, it had been made illegal to build half-timbered houses in the city, and they were built of local sandstone usually, but they were still wooden framed
Yeah.
and had a lot of wooden floors and furniture and so on. And some of the streets were narrow, not all of them by any means, but some of them were still quite narrow and so on. So it did spread. Once it got going, um, it was pretty much unstoppable.
Hmm.
The one or two steel frame buildings survived, but even then, even if you tried to take shelter in one of those steel frames, but the fact that it didn't completely burn down is irrelevant because you probably would have suffocated. Like the wretched people we were just talking about. So, the firestorm went and then it abated sometime in the early morning. It started to rain apart from anything else as dawn approached. The second raid was 1:30 to 1:45, or 1:20 to 1:45 roughly in the morning. And after that, it took some hours, but nevertheless, the firestorm did abate. Things carried on burning for some days, but the firestorm itself abated. Um,
Well, I was gonna.
I'm just saying, you had to have Coventry, for instance, which is the other thing I know a lot about. The Germans bombed it very intensively, but spread over about 10 hours, I think.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of little fires and lots of buildings that would have been very attractive for a firestorm to establish itself.
Mm.
Um, but there were gaps between the waves of bombers, which went back to France and came back having been reloaded with bombs and things like that. So Bomber Harris himself said, he said, Coventry would have been imperfect for a firestorm, except that there was the concentration of explosives, but there wasn't the concentration in terms of timing.
Mm.
And that was what really creates a firestorm, when you have such this inexorable thing starting and then being fed over a relatively short period of time. You would think a longer period of time would maybe be better established, but no, actually, because things go out and people get a chance to put fires out and so on and so on.
I was going to say about the comparison between Dresden and somewhere like Tokyo. But I guess the biggest comparison is the structure of the buildings, isn't it?
Oh, Tokyo was, oh yeah, wooden buildings.
Mm.
I mean, absolutely. Well, it's incredibly intensive bombing. I mean, again, daylight bombing, being Americans. Yeah, like 100,000 people
Yeah.
killed in the big raid on Tokyo in 1945. Dresden looked as though it might have that sort of scale to it on the night, because it was
Yeah.
so devastating and so awful, and appeared to kill so many people. And it did kill an awful lot of people, a shocking number of people. But it wasn't, you weren't talking about the kind of numbers you're talking about with Tokyo.
Yeah.
Tokyo was a freak thing. As if more people were killed in Tokyo than by the atomic bomb later in the summer. I mean, in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, just by high explosives and incendiaries.
Yeah. What was the communication like between various Allied commands? And was there any disagreements?
About Dresden itself, I don't think so. The only thing that happened was that usually, if you were doing a joint raid with the Americans, as all these things were planned to be, the Americans would go in first and start the whole thing off, and the British would come at night using the fires from the American raid during the daylight to guide themselves to the target. The weather was so bad, though, during the daytime on February the 13th, that the Americans had been doing. So had to switch it round, and the Americans came the next day instead. Mm-hmm. And the British came in basically cold onto the target at 10 o'clock that night, when the meteorologists had predicted that there might well be a gap in the clouds which would enable accurate bombing of the target, which proved to be the case. That was one of the things that made Dresden so lethal. There was no anti-aircraft artillery, but that had been withdrawn, the last of it, the previous month. And a lot of it was just turned over to ground use to fighting the Russians, and some of it fighting in the Ruhr pocket against the Western Allies. And so they didn't need to worry about anti-aircraft fire. They could see the target. It was beautifully clear. So they went down low. I mean, particularly when 5 Group came in at 10 o'clock, they went right down and could basically just dropping stuff. And that made it all the more lethal.
Yeah.
So in the event, I don't know whether it made any difference that the Americans hadn't gone in first, but in the event, it proved to be super lethal. I mean, everything went right, which if you know anything about the history of the bombing war, you will know that was a very uncommon occurrence
Yeah, yeah,
that, that there were no problems, but there weren't, and there were no. The German fighters were grounded too. Um, what's now Dresden Airport, Klutsche, north of the city, was a night fighter base. Um, but they were grounded because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. They were supplying the besieged city of Breslau, now
yeah.
Wrocław in Poland, about 70 or 80 miles to the east, on a shuttle basis, and they just didn't want to draw attention to themselves. The next day, when the Americans came during the day, a few of the German fighters did actually go up into the sky after them, but that's a different question. But no, I mean, basically, whatever the discussions were that went on, they were certainly not um, heated or difficult,
Yeah.
and they were purely practical. I think any discussions that came in disagreements, which you may or may not know about, would have been technical, not to do with anything, any objection, for instance, to bombing Dresden.
And your book includes like an exact date, Tuesday, the 13th of February, 1945. Why was it so important to anchor the narrative on that specific day?
Well, that was the big day. Well, actually, I suppose technically speaking, the second wave of the British raid. I mean, the first wave went in just after 10 o'clock, and dropped about somewhere between 800 and 900 tons of bombs, roughly. I think it's 57% high explosive, 43% incendiaries.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was a pause, and of course, a great many people in the city thought that that was it. The raid was over. In other words, if you'd survived that, you would be fine. But then the second wave, which was much bigger, about 500, 600 bombers, and dropped 1,800 tons of bombs, again, roughly
Wow.
55, 45, I think,
Mm-hmm.
high explosive to incendiaries, came in between 1 and 1:45 in the morning, just when everybody thought they got away with it for the night and they could start to relax. It was a particularly sort of, I mean, it's the double tap.
Yeah,
It's the classic. You do that, and so, you get the rescue gangs, you get the people who've come back out of the thing, out of the cellars and bomb shelters, and it's brutal but effective. And you've seen, I mean, it's still used. I mean, look at the bombing in Gaza.
yeah.
It's exactly the same techniques are used, and we can't criticize the Israelis for doing something that actually the Allies and the Germans did. Everybody did it.
Yeah.
It was done in the case of Coventry. The Germans, gave them, so to speak, gave people time to relax and get out of their shelters, and then bomb them again.
It is intentionally killing civilians, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, you're destroying things that can advance the war, but you're also murdering civilians.
Yeah, you they knew perfectly well. I mean, everybody knew perfectly well, and everybody denied it. They always do. It's Hugh Sinclair, the aviation minister, or one of his underlings would pop up in Parliament saying, "No, certainly not. We never attack civilians.
Yeah.
We only attack military targets," and it's not true. Because they did attack military targets, and when there were military targets, there were factories, and there were the railway, and there was but they didn't, for instance, bomb the garrison, and they knew perfectly well where that was. So really, there's no sweetening it.
Yeah.
There's no sweetening it. This was done, and the Germans did the same thing. um, in the Blitz in Britain and in Russia and Poland and all these other places. There really wasn't a huge amount of difference. The difference for the Germans aircraft on Hitler's orders had to be both suitable both for bombing and for ground attacks.
Yeah.
Against ground forces, which meant that their bomb load was limited, which made them actually less able to inflict the kind of damage, including firestorms,
Yeah.
than the big Lancasters and Halifaxes and Flying Fortresses and Liberators and so on that the Western Allies had, and all they did was have bombs on them. They weren't used for it. I mean, occasionally they used them for ground attack, and after when the breakout from D-Day, for instance, the RAF did send in bombers against ground forces, but it was quite. It wasn't that wasn't their chief thing that they did. They did that relatively rarely. But no, I mean they were machines for creating massive damage against infrastructure. But infrastructure in a city is full of people.
Yeah, yeah.
you can't say, oh no, we're just damaging infrastructure. Well, what about all those people who live in the infrastructure? The thousands and thousands of those. But the hypocrisy is always there and is still there.
Yeah. And we've talked about the Soviets for a bit. What part did the advancing Soviet army play on the timing and justification of their bombing?
Well, it was supposed to help the Russians. There's no question about that. The weird thing was, of course, that the Russians were not that far away at the time of the bombing, but they didn't actually take Dresden until the last day of the war, May the 8th. Dresden ended up being the last major German city to be unoccupied by the Allies, either the Russians or the Western Allies, at the end of the war. Whether that was because basically it was a heap of rubble and who wanted that? And you'd have to feed the people and you'd have to, fight your way through the rubble and all the rest of it, because there was still a certain amount of resistance going on. But yeah, Dresden was on the fringe of the fighting in February 45, but actually then didn't really suffer that much from the fighting. I mean, there was a German counteroffensive near Bautzen, which is a similar part of Saxony, in I think April 45, which forces from Dresden participated in. But that's as far as it went. The city wasn't really involved. I mean, if you look at in February 45, the eastern side of the Elbe River, on which Dresden is, was actually a military defense zone. In other words, it was considered to be a part of, behind the front, whereas the western part of the city was relatively free of military control. The eastern side wasn't. I mean, you had to have written permission from Berlin, basically, to move troops or for troops to go into the western part of the city at that point. They were supposed to stay there. And of course, most of them were based in the eastern part because that's where the garrison buildings were, in the Hecht to the north and east of the Elbe. It was a frontline city by February 45, but then weirdly, it remained untaken. I mean, the Americans took Leipzig. They didn't take Chemnitz. They sat on the outskirts and let the Russians take it. but nobody took Dresden. Not till the last day of the war, um, when Muchman fled his capital, was eventually rounded up and ended up in the Lubyanka in Moscow.
Why was the bombing not more devastating?
It was devastating, but it didn't destroy the whole city.
Yeah.
It destroyed the central parts of the city mainly, and the southern central, but it didn't destroy. It didn't weirdly destroy the much of the industrial areas, which was in the northwest of the city.
Yeah.
And they were working class areas too. The parts it destroyed were mainly in the center of the city. That's where the aiming points were for the bullets. Yeah. So yes, all that was terrible, and the damage to both human life and precious architectural heritage was terrible. But a lot of the city was reasonably intact after the bombing. For instance, I interviewed a vicar called Pastor Hoch, who was very much responsible for the rebuilding of the Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady in Dresden, which was a big project after reunification. And he was in Lockwitz, which is a suburb from which you can see the city. I mean, it's only about 3 or 4 miles away.
Yeah.
It was almost completely undamaged. A lot of these areas were, a lot of the fringe areas of the city. And so people are amazing. One of the things you learn if you dare to spend a lot of time reading and thinking about bombing in World War II, depressing subject as it is in many ways, is that people are incredibly resilient.
Yeah.
And actually, to be honest, also the German ability to recover from damage, particularly things like, for instance, one of the easiest things to replace are railway lines. People think, oh, we've bombed the railway lines, they won't be done. It's actually relatively easy to replace railway lines. You just even out the ground again and whack some tracks down. I mean, I'm being frivolous, but that's basically what happens. You've got huge crews of slave labor and POW labor and so on. You bring those in, and you rebuild the tracks in really relatively short order. The resilience and the ingenuity was and is extraordinary. That's not peculiar to Germany, although it must be said that the German restoration capacity after air raids was quite extraordinary. They learned so much in those years of being bombed. It was same in Britain. I mean, Coventry, for instance, again, the repairs to factories and major buildings were really very quickly effected. I mean, it wasn't perfect, of course. You still, everything could reach some kind of functionality. It wasn't maybe the maximum functionality, and in some cases it wasn't possible, but in huge amounts of it. I mean, really, Coventry was bombed in November 1940. By the new year, pretty much everything was working again. It's extraordinary the extent to which that's the case. I mean, in the case of the German experience in February 44, the trouble is they were losing the war and losing it fast, and so not a great deal of stuff could be diverted to rescuing and recovering the city and its inhabitants, but they still did a pretty amazing job.
Yeah.
And everybody points out that Himmler, when told of the destruction of Dresden, said, oh, well, this is terrible, but it won't be as bad as you think it is. It never is. It always feels very bad when it's just happened. And Goebbels made much the same observation. And it's true. Everybody thinks far more people have been killed than actually were.
Yeah.
And everybody thinks that the damage is irreparable, and because that's the way it looks. It's terrible. I mean, it's appalling. I mean, the mayhem and the apocalyptic destruction is such, and the shock, and people are in shock.
Yeah.
Um, but
Well,
once you get a chance to think about it and get over it, firstly, functionality can be, the beauty of the thing will not be restored, but the functionality might. And and it's never as many dead. In Coventry, people were convinced for years after the war that thousands of people in Coventry had in fact been killed, and because they'd been in cellars and they were asphyxiated or what have you. But the government had covered it up, and they'd sealed the cellars and just said there were 600 people had died. In fact,
wow.
it was thousands. But not true, of course. But that's how it felt. It felt like the apocalyptic feel of the whole experience was such that somehow you have to think it's much worse than it actually was, because that gives it meaning for you.
Well, I was going to ask you about the Nazi propaganda and their response to the bombing. And like you say, they lied about the numbers.
Yeah, they added a naught basically.
Yeah.
Goebbels, by February 1945, it was obvious that Germany could never win the war except by some extraordinary thing like inventing an atomic bomb or something, which they had failed to do. And so it was pointless to just reduce, as they had earlier in the war, just endless reports of victories and cheer everybody up that way and say, yeah, we're winning. Just, of course, we have a few setbacks, but, we're winning, basically, after Stalingrad and that sort of thing. So really, basically, by the whole psychological direction of the propaganda changed, and it was basically, this is terrible, but it's going to be even worse if we let them win because they're all monsters. Look at what they're doing, and that. So instead of trying to make things look better than they actually were, in a sense, they made things look worse than they actually were. There was a big slogan that you would find painted on walls: "Enjoy the war, the peace will be terrible." And that was pretty much the Goebbels line. It was also a cynical truth, but of course, in the end, of course, we know that it's amazing how quickly Germany did recover after the war. Actually, in general, not just Dresden, but other places, and extraordinary. Actually, it was thought that it'd be at least 70 years before most of the major German cities could be brought back to any kind of decent functionality.
Yeah.
And it was not the case.
A lot quicker than that.
A lot quicker. Yeah. Even East Germany, which didn't have the advantages that the West Germans had of American aid and good old-fashioned capitalism. Even with the Russians nicking anything that wasn't nailed down, the East Germans did recover to an extraordinary extent after the war. Quite an achievement, actually, given the limitations of the political and economic system.
And you may have answered this, but you talk in the book about the Dresdeners' fatal complacency, about the possibility of the air raid. How did that affect their preparedness? Was it just the fact that they were blasé about it and just didn't prepare?
I think on an individual level, I think that was true. The real problem, and we talked about this earlier on, was that the central government in Berlin also hadn't given Dresden the money and the resources to actually build proper air raid shelters. And so what they did do was they reinforced cellars and basements. And lots of German houses and apartment blocks have basements, and relied on that. And they also, with terraced streets, they knocked out the walls between the basements, going along various streets. So you could, in theory, if say the entrance to your basement was covered in rubble and you couldn't get out that way, you could actually go into the next door and try and get out that way, and so on. Which sounds like a great idea, except that it's not, because what happens then is that fires and also drafts of carbon monoxide, lethal carbon monoxide, also could spread through those cellars from building to building. They were called Durchbrüche, breakthroughs. They just would knock a hole in the cellar wall, so you could go from cellar to cellar, and theoretically go right to the end of the street and come out that way, which sounds, as I said, like a great idea, except that it turned out not to be the case. In fact, it probably killed quite a lot of people, that, because all you needed was to have carbon monoxide in one cellar and it was spread to the next, and so on and so on. So they had all that, but they didn't have much in there were big official bunkers. There was one underneath the Albertinum, which is on the river beneath the art gallery and everything, and there was a big bunker from air raid defense forces, and there was a bunker in the hills behind the city which belonged to the SS and the party leadership, and there's a big bunker under Mutzmann's villa in the city, which was pretty well provided for. But apart from that, there really wasn't much. I mean, there was nothing, but it was primitive. The sophistication, there were no air filters. I mean, the Gutzpaganda, who I mentioned earlier on, beneath this distillery factory in Friedrichstadt, which is just across the river and quite near the aiming point for the Brits, but given the way it went out, fanned out, it wasn't actually affected. It was affected by the American raid the next day, which was the marshalling yards region next door. But anyway, they had built a bomb shelter underneath the distillery with air filters and all the stuff that you need, and the bells and whistles that you need to make a shelter pretty secure, no matter what happens. And before the raid, you would show it to his father would show it to people, and they would laugh and they'd say, you know, anything like this. Why are you spending all this money on this ridiculously elaborate air raid shelter? You know, we don't need it. So there was this feeling that I mean, in a way, you can understand people having an everyday life that's been so peaceful and so surrounded by rather lovely things, because it was a gorgeous city. There's no question about that. To just be incredulous. I mean, we're all like that. I mean, our daily life seems normal, and we can't believe that it would be abnormal. I mean, before Russia attacked Ukraine in February 2022, most Ukrainians couldn't believe it would happen. I know this. There were interviews with people saying, "Oh, I know what the Russians are. There are, you know, it's not going to happen."
Yeah, I know a Ukrainian girl who never thought it would happen, and she woke up one morning and tanks were rolling past her window.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, yeah. So, finally, 80 years later, what do you hope that the modern reader will take away from Dresden?
Well, I mean, like any tragedy, and a tragedy it definitely was,
Yeah.
they will sadly experience a lot of pity and terror about that something like that could happen.
Mm.
What I'm when I first wrote it, 20 years ago, I would have been much more optimistic about the lessons that the human race had learned from the Second World War.
Yeah.
Not as optimistic these days. Um, how
Yeah.
can we be? It seems impossible. I never 2001 when I first started writing, researching, finishing the book in 2004.
Hmm.
Um, I would never have believed that it was like there was this old world where these things happen,
Yeah.
and of course there's still little wars going on in the world, but not big wars between sophisticated, advanced nations,
Mm.
uh, 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 where this kind of level of destruction and brutality uh, existed. I think I really thought, and I think most of us thought, that's behind us now. I don't think
Yeah.
that. I mean, I hope people draw conclusions that we must desperately try to avoid these kind of wars, but we haven't, and
Yeah.
we're stuck with. We seem stuck with them, and it seems like something like Dresden is like a sort of inoculation, a vaccination,
Yeah.
and eventually, after 70 years, it wears off, and
Mm.
suddenly nobody cares anymore. Suddenly, everybody's talking about the kind of levels of international violence
Yeah.
that that should be impossible if you take the slightest hint or lessons from the past. But it seems like it just wears off. The horror of these
Yeah.
things wears off, and we get back to the dreadfully human, sadly, business of killing each other.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, when we have VE Day, the the biggest phrase that people use is "lest we forget." Well, I think we already have.
I don't think we've forgotten
Unfortunately,
people's sacrifice, but I think we've forgotten the lessons of avoiding war.
yeah. Unfortunately,
But if somebody really wants to have a war, like Mr. Putin wants to have a war, you can't stop them.
no.
I'm afraid that's a lesson.
And unfortunately, with the invention of the atomic bomb, if it got to the stage where it got in the World War II, I think it'd just be over.
Yes, we've got a strange experience, haven't we? You've got the notion, being. I mean, I'm older than you. I mean, I went through the whole 60s and so on, 70s, of the kind of nuclear standoff between
Yeah.
the Americans and the Russians in particular. Um, and it seemed like any kind of war would lead to nuclear politics apocalypse almost
Yeah.
immediately. Whereas actually what we're learning now is that the level of the threshold, so to speak, for war, you can have a really quite a major war without unleashing a nuclear war. And in fact,
Yeah.
in a way, it gives somebody like Putin impunity because nobody wants a nuclear war.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how far you can push things, and exploiting that fear of nuclear war and get away with it. Um, I mean, I don't know at what level there has to be conflict in the world, in Ukraine or elsewhere, um, for there to be a really serious danger of nuclear war. Sooner or later, you can see it happening,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
because things get completely out of control. But it's amazing how little deterrence to really quite high levels of warfare
Mm.
the existence of atomic weapons has proved to provide. It's quite shocking, actually. I mean, the only justification for atomic weapons was that it had to put an end to war because we couldn't have another war. Well, we do,
Yeah.
and it can be quite major. I mean, really major, and the existence of nuclear weapons doesn't stop it.
Mm. Well, Donald Trump says he's solved 6 wars in 6 months, so we're in good hands.
And on that note, I think I'll go and stick my head in the oven.
Well, the book is Dresden, and I'll put a link down below so people can get a hold of it. It's an excellent book. It's really, really good. The history of Dresden is awesome in that as well. So, any more books in the pipeline?
I see. Yeah, I mean, I'm getting on a bit now. Um, um, I'm doing this and that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can do the kind of traipsing around Europe with a voice recorder that I used to be able to do. But we shall see. Watch the space.
Okay, we will. And if you do get any more books out, come back and talk to us about it.
Brilliant, John. Nice to
Okay.
talk to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated.
Well,
You take care. Bye-bye.
bye.
Hello, and if you're still with us, thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and thank you so much for Fredrick Taylor for talking to me. It was an awesome conversation yet again. Very, very interested indeed. And if you want a copy of his book, Dresden, there's a link down below. So, next week we shall be talking to Lynette Ramsey Silver about her book Sandokan. And Sandokan was a Japanese POW camp in World War II. In part, the book is horrific of what the Japanese put the POWs through. In part, it is a story of bravery. In part, it is like an action thriller. So I'm really looking forward to talking to Lynette about her book and about the events around Sandokan. So don't forget, like and subscribe if you like this content, and join us next week for Lynette Ramsey Silver. Take care and look after yourself. Thank you.